Before I start, just one quick census disclaimer. Nothing I say today necessarily reflects the views of the US Census Bureau. So when you look at the data on growth of cities across the US, you're really struck by two things. And the first thing is it's very persistent. So if a city is growing strongly one year, it's likely to keep growing that next year. And second, there's a lot of dispersion in median run growth rates. And as a result, some cities grow fast for many years, some seem to stagnate. As an example, so a top quartile city in the US over the last 40 years would see a 10-year employment growth of about 40%. A city in the bottom quartile of employment growth would even shrink a couple of percentage points. So in this paper, I'm going to explore the role of new firms in explaining this persistence of local growth across space. And I'm going to do this in 4 parts. So first, I'm going to begin with the US Census Microdata, basically data on every firm, private employer firm and establishment in the US. And I'm going to document some new facts about local growth. So first, I'm going to show you that persistent contributions from new entrants account for most local employment growth at the city level. So entry rates across cities are very persistent, and variation in these entry rates across space accounts for much of the medium run dispersion we see at the city level. Then I'll show you that in contrast, exit rates have little to do with local growth. So they vary little, and in particular, they look unrelated to how fast a place is growing. And finally, I'll show you that as cities grow, the post-entry life cycle of firms and establishments doesn't change in an observable way. So it's not the case that firms and establishments in larger cities grow any faster, and nor do they see different survival probabilities at any stage of their lives. So the second and third fact there, they add color to how to interpret the first. So for instance, it's not the case that when we see lots of entry of new firms in a city, we also see elevated exit rates. So reallocation through exit is not going to be central to understanding local growth. And it also doesn't look like as cities grow, they attract different kinds of firms and establishments in a way that would influence median run growth. So my takeaway is that local growth is mostly about sustained high entry rates. So then I'm going to propose a theory to explain the persistence of entry rates through time. And that theory is going to be about a dynamic interaction of firm and worker location choice. And this interaction will be based on demand linkages at the local level. And the idea is that when a place gets a shock and new people move into an area, that increases demand for local goods and services. Increased demand will incentivize the entry of new firms, who in turn increase wages. But those higher wages will then even attract more workers to the area, propagating and amplifying the original shock through time. So I'm also going to use the US Census Microdata to estimate a quantitative version of this theory and assess the strength of propagation coming from demand linkages. And there are really 2 payoffs to doing this. So first, I'm going to use that estimated model to understand the evolution of spatial growth in the last 50 years in the US. And what I'll show you is that the very marked decline of employment in the Rust Belt and the Midwest, which starts with the decline of manufacturing, has been massively amplified by a dearth of entry across all sectors in those local economies. So everything from professional services, restaurants, construction, medical establishments. And the lack of new business creation in these sectors, as older establishments have exited, has doubled the employment gap between the manufacturing intensive regions of the US and the service heavy regions of the US. So this is really a story that's kind of common in the media. So, you know, Midwestern town loses a factory and all other local businesses are affected. But I'm bringing a bit of a twist to the classic story. So it's not that all the local businesses immediately close after a manufacturing shock. As I say, exit rates are mostly unconnected to local economic conditions. Firms die, they die all the time, and they keep dying. What really propels the decline of the Rust Belt is that nothing new takes the place of those who die. And because entry decisions take time to play out, that initial shock to manufacturing ends up taking a long, slow time to propagate across space. And the second thing is to think about policy. So the presence of demand linkages and spatial mobility naturally leads to an inefficiency in that founders of new firms aren't fully compensated for their effect on local economic activity, and they don't internalize the fact that their startup decisions have an impact on spatial allocation to workers. And this suggests a role for policy, and one particular I want to emphasize, in that even with full mobility of workers across space, you still find that spatial transitions are too slow from a planner's point of view. At any given time, some regions of the country will be growing for many different reasons, some declining, like the US Rust Belt. And there's a role for targeted entry subsidies in booming regions to speed up spatial reallocation of workers relative to the competitive benchmark. On the other hand, what seems to happen in practice is that there are attempts to rescue declining regions with new business incentives and subsidies for new firms. And these look counterproductive from a national welfare perspective. So the main data I'm going to be using is the US Census Longitudinal Business Database, the LBD. So this is administrative data. It's data on every employer establishment in the US. And there's a couple of key variables that are key for what I'm doing. So first we have employment, which is basically head count at March 12, payroll, so all annual compensation, salaries, bonuses, and these sorts of things lumped together. The age of the establishment, which is years since hiring its first employee. Detailed industry codes down to the 6-digit NICE level, which have been made consistent over time by work of Teresa Fort and Sean Klimek. Also ownership, so consistent IDs at the firm level, so I can track an ownership record for each establishment across space. And the distinction between firms and establishments I'm going to be very clear on at very different points in the talk. And also location data. So I'm going to use counties and commuting zones in this talk today. Commuting zones are basically collections of counties which see high inter-county commuting flows. Nothing about what I'm going to say is going to depend crucially on the distinction between counties and commuting zones. And to the LBD, I'm also going to add some sales data from IRS tax records to give a notion of sales of firms. So to give you an idea of what the dispersion in commuting zone growth looks like, this is all roughly 700 commuting zones in the US since 1975. And I'm plotting their employment in each year relative to 1975. So you can see a city at kind of the 90th percentile of employment growth has seen about a 250% expansion in employment in the last 40 years, whereas a city round about the 10th percentile has barely grown at all. So what are some examples? Well, the fastest growing places in the US, as we all know, have really been the Western states, places like Denver, Eugene, Oregon. Phoenix, Arizona has just been on a completely explosive growth path, whereas a city like classic Detroit has seen kind of ups and downs over the last 40 years, but has barely expanded at all in terms of employment. So now I'll get to these facts, the new facts that I document. So first, let me show you that persistent variation in the entry of new firms and establishments accounts for most employment growth at the local level. So first, I'll start very simply. This is the relationship between the new establishment share at any point in time at either the county or commuting zone level and subsequent 10-year employment growth. And what you can see is that places with a lot of new establishments today see very fast employment growth over the next 10 years. And the relationship is basically the same, whether you do it at the county or the commuting zone level. Now, this is the establishment relationship. It holds pretty much exactly the same way if you look at true new firms. So not just new establishments to the US Census, but establishments which are true new firms. And the reason is because in any given year, anywhere from 80% to 90% of new establishments look like true new firms to the US Census. So it also holds at different time horizons. You can look at 10-year employment growth, 5-year employment growth, 1-year employment growth. You'll see this very strong predictive relationship. Holds also for wage growth. So places with a lot of new establishments today see much faster wage growth than places with a lot of older establishments. And it holds throughout the conditional distribution. So this is the conditional mean. You can show different conditional quantiles, and they all show this very strong relationship between employment growth and the new establishment share. So where is that employment growth actually coming from? Now I'll decompose it down. So here, what I'm showing you, I'll take a couple of seconds to explain. These blue bars are net employment growth in a commuting zone, and I've divided them up into 10 deciles of 10-year employment growth. So the ones on the right are the very fastest growing commuting zones. They see kind of a 10-year employment growth, let's say, of 60%. And the ones down sort of in the first and second decile see almost a small contraction in 10-year employment growth. And basically, you can decompose these into contributions from the incumbent establishments who were around at the start of that 10-year period, and new entrant establishments who come in over that 10-year period. So the green bar and the black bar will add up to the blue bar, okay? And you notice a couple of things when you do this. First, the contribution of incumbent establishments who were already there 10 years ago is just persistently negative. So they, as a group, incumbent establishments will shrink no matter where they are in space in this employment growth distribution. You can break out these entrant contributions into each cohort of entering establishments. And if you do that, you notice that what you're really seeing is a lot of persistent entry. So it's a story about if entry rates are high in 1 year, they tend to stay high over the next couple of years. And each cohort of entering establishments will see strong contributions to employment growth. So, I mean, a good question is, could it look any other way than this? Does it have to look this way? Well, remember that in levels, the majority of employment in these commuting zones is at large incumbent establishments. But as a group, nowhere do these establishments actually add employment across space over time. They're always shrinking as a group, even in the very fastest places. So on net, all growth is from entry everywhere. And notice as well that most of the variation in these blue bars actually comes from variation in the entry share. In a way I'll make precise in a second. So most of the variation is entry contributions. You do see some variation in the contributions of incumbent growth, but it's much less marked than what you see with entrants. So I'll just emphasize this point about persistent entry. So the startup rate over time is very highly autocorrelated. Okay, so this is the autocorrelation at kind of different lag lengths out to 10 years between the startup rate today and the startup rate at different time horizons in the past. And what you see, the dark blue line here is the commuting zone level. So we see a lot of persistence in the entry rate there. As you go to finer and finer geographic units, that persistence gets lower, and that's mainly because you get a lot more noise as you go down to the county level. So here I'm showing county levels with populations of greater than 50,000 is this line in the middle, and counties, all counties, including even the very smallest place, is the line at the bottom. So we see a lot of autocorrelation in the startup rate. And now on that variance decomposition point, so the majority of the variance being accounted for by entry, you can just do a simple decomposition into two components, that coming from entrants, incumbents, and a covariance term. And more than 50% of the total variance in 10-year employment growth is about entrants. Very little is about variations in the rate at which incumbents shrink across space. So that's entry. What about exit? Well, it turns out that exit is mainly unrelated to employment growth at the local level. So I show this in a couple of ways in the paper, but here's a very simple one. These again are the 10 deciles of employment growth at the commuting zone level, going from say 60% in the fastest growing commuting zones down to shrinkage in the slowest growing commuting zones. And the red line is the 10-year exit rate, the establishment exit rate in those commuting zones over those 10-year periods. And it's basically flat at about 53%. You see a little bit of variation here in the very fastest and in the very slowest growing commuting zones, but it's basically not correlated at all with employment growth at the local level. You can do this in a more detailed fashion by adjusting for the age distribution of each place. And I do this in an appendix to the paper. You can find this conclusion is unchanged in that exit rates don't really look related to local growth. The third thing I want to highlight is that as places grow, it doesn't look like the firm life cycle changes in an observable way. So in two particular senses. So first, establishments and firms don't seem to grow any faster in larger areas. And second, differences in exit rates between large and small areas look completely negligible. So let me make that precise. So first, on this growth point, I'm going to estimate employment growth at the establishment level conditional on survival. So I'll regress changes in employment on first a bunch of non-parametric age dummies, and then I'll interact those age dummies with the size of the place in the year that that establishment hired its first employee, along with a bunch of controls. So industry fixed effects, time fixed effects, state fixed effects, and dummies for whether you're in a multi-establishment firm or not. And if you do that, you get this. So this is the change in employment conditional on survival by age at the establishment level, where I'm breaking this out into different geographic units. So there's actually 3 lines here, whether you're in a large commuting zone, medium commuting zone, or a small commuting zone, red, blue, or green, but the lines lie virtually on top of one another. So there doesn't look like there's any difference in growth conditional on survival at the establishment level between large and small areas. And you can do the same thing with exit rates, okay? So here I'm looking at just non-parametric survival estimates by age. So whether you exit at a given age in small, medium, and large commuting zones. And again, you see there's almost no difference. There's a bit of elevated exit in very large commuting zones like New York at the start of an establishment's life, but this adds up cumulatively to no more than like a 1.5% survival difference by 30 years of life. So I have a bunch of further detail and robustness to that in the paper, but basically I'll mention a couple of them in that. So establishment employment essentially evolves in parallel across different area sizes. There are differences in size at entry, but there's no differences in growth across the life cycle of an establishment. The same is not just true for just employment, it also looks exactly the same when you do the picture for average wages or sales per worker. They don't grow any faster at the establishment level in large or small places. You can look within very detailed industry classifications, that doesn't change the conclusions. And the results I've got for establishments also hold for firms when you condition on a firm's birthplace. Now, the location of a firm is not a well-defined thing. Firms can exist at multiple points in space, but most firms, even ones that grow very fast in the data, tend to start with a signal establishment that we can see. So once you condition on the birthplace of a firm, you can show that firms who are born in very dense places don't seem to grow any faster over their life cycle on the extensive margin of adding establishments or on the intensive margin of employment with establishments. So my conclusion from this is as places become larger, the firm life cycle doesn't change in any observable way. So to sum up those 3 facts, I think persistent variation in the entry margin accounts for much medium frequency city growth. So before I get to how I think about a theory of these facts, let me just pause and take 1 or 2 questions on the data. Fabian, if you've got.
I think we're going to take the question from Andrea, which was marked as clarifying, but is rather long. So Andrea, let me just unmute you and you can ask your question yourself.
Yeah.
Andrea, you have to, yeah.
Yes. Hi, Conor.
Hi, Andrea.
So I was just thinking whether we're reasoning a kind in a relative terms. So basically, you have that you have a positive shock. So some city grow, and the one who stay behind, like Flint in Michigan, for instance, they are just shrinking in a relative term, but in absolute term, they shrink very little because it is on the, I mean, everything happens on the extensive margin. So no new creation of firms in Flint, a lot of creation of firms elsewhere, and just some incumbents in Flint are shrinking on the intensive margin.
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm saying. I mean, in relative terms versus absolute, I mean, during this period in the US, there's a fair amount of population growth. So in absolute terms, there are actually only a few commuting zones that shrink absolutely, but a lot obviously going on there are a lot of places shrinking in relative terms. And what I'm saying is that most of that is not due to establishment exit, differential exit. I mean, exit is going on all the time. And it's not going on at particularly elevated rates in these places that are shrinking in relative terms. What's really happening is just a dearth of firm creation and establishment creation that is causing massive amplification of these differences. Okay. Maybe I'll take one.
And then we have another question from Sergio. Sergio, you can talk now.
Oh, hi, Fabian. Thanks. Can you hear me? I guess so.
Hi, Sergio.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was. I think you kind of answered it in your previous slide. It was about because you were talking about establishments.
Yeah.
But the firm life cycle doesn't seem to be different in terms of expanding the number of establishments. Kind of like Lutzner, like you make copies of your establishments, and that doesn't seem to be. That's right.
I mean, that doesn't look to be related to the size of a place, at least. It gets more difficult when you think about the growth of a place and firms expanding on the extensive margin. But
yeah, I guess you were conditioning on the starting place of the firm. But if you just say, let me condition on the firm being present in a place, like if I'm McDonald's and I enter Detroit, and if I'm McDonald's and I enter some other like Arizona in Phoenix, do I expand more in one city or another? Like my pattern of expansion of establishments, I'm going to see more McDonald's opening in Phoenix than McDonald's opening in Detroit, and the same thing should happen in this idea, in this hypothesis.
Yes, exactly.
So whether that you should see, but I don't know if you do.
Yeah, no, you do see that. So exactly. So, I mean, there's both things are going on in that there are new establishments of existing incumbent firms and totally new establishments of new firms, of firms that have never been seen before by the census. Now, as I said when I started, it's just a fact that most in terms of numbers, most new establishments are true new firms. Employment weighted, it's weighted towards incumbent firms. But yeah, both are going on in the data. So you're getting expansion on the extensive margin of entry of new establishments from totally new firms and incumbent firms. And I'm going to think about these things a bit symmetrically in the theory that I talked about.
Okay. That's fair. I don't need to keep going.
Okay. Thank you, Sergio.
Conor,
do you think we have time for one more question from Giacomo? Or?
Yeah, certainly.
Or we can.
Giacomo. Maybe actually,
Giacomo.
Yeah, if it's
hi, Conor. So I was wondering, right? There's a big literature showing that firm density predicts entry, employment growth, those sorts of things. And in that literature, one concern we've always had is showing this isn't just because density is proxy for age. And I think we have satisfied ourselves it's not. So the question is, if you do here vice versa, is the effect the same once you control for firm density or firm size? Is it somewhat reduced? Is it much reduced?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, the point I'm making here is maybe I'll just go back and have a look at one of these. So it's certainly true that firms in larger cities or denser cities, they pay higher average wages, they're larger, and they have higher average sales. That's certainly true.
No, sorry, but what I had in mind, right, as a Glaser student and co-author is that we know that at the city industry and city industry level, having high firm density, so actually small firms, predicts entry,
right,
employment growth, etc. Right? And we've always had in this picture the question, but maybe you don't understand. It's purely because you have lots of firms that have just entered and there's autocorrelation in entry. And there we think that the answer is no, that's true, but there's something else. So I was wondering here if you can ask, the opposite question, but if you take into account that having lots of small firms is good for entry and having lots of recent entrants typically means having lots of small firms,
Yeah. To tell you exactly how I think about this, maybe I'll just go straight to the theory now and we'll see if that answers your question.
Fair.
So, yeah, I want to think about how this persistence in the creation of new establishments actually arises. And one answer is the relationship with demand externalities and fixed costs. So a dynamic interaction between worker and firm location choice. So the idea is that, when a place gets a shock and people move in, this raises demand for local goods and services. New entrants come in to meet this demand, raise wages, and even more people move in. And that gives you extra cohorts of new establishments and firms through time. So you get this very young city dynamic with lots of entry and persistent entry through time. And the payoff of thinking about it in this way, you can explain the long sluggish effects of sectoral shocks, say in the industrial Midwest and in the Rust Belt, that these things take time to play out because entry takes time to play out. And it also gives you a way to think about policy and spatial misallocation. So what I'm gonna do is lay out a fairly standard model of firm dynamics. But when you put it in this spatial context and think about local demand, it has these extra implications of persistence and demand externalities. So I'm going to think about three classes of workers, essentially, three classes of agents. So there's workers who are free to move at any time, and they only care about consumption, some housing, and an amenity. And that amenity is going to be place specific and potentially varying through time. There are also going to be a bunch of capitalists. They're fixed in place, and they do all the investment in the local firms and establishments. And third, there's going to be a class of landlords. They're fixed in place too, and they're going to own the local land supply and supply housing with some elasticity. So the landlords are basically residual claimants on the economic activity in the location after the workers and capitalists. So the production structure is going to be a very standard firm dynamics model. There's going to be a final good aggregate, which is just freely traded across space. And that final good is assembled by competitive firms in a final goods sector, and those intermediates are going to be assembled locally. So the number of intermediates locally is going to matter for how much of the final good is produced within a location. And the production of those intermediates is going to be very standard. So I'm just going to have a local TFP term B. There's going to be an efficiency that is firm or establishment specific, Z, which can be moving around and is stochastic. And it's just going to be linear in the amount of labor that you hire. So so that's the static environment. Now I'll talk about the dynamics of the environment. So an intermediates firm is going to enter by buying a building. So they're going to have to pay a fixed cost by buying a building where land is a component of that building. So that building is going to be made by combining land and a final good in a competitive construction sector. And after they've bought that building, they're going to draw an initial efficiency from some distribution G. After they enter, they're going to receive stochastic shocks to that efficiency. And those shocks are going to be very simple. They're either going to improve by a fixed step size or decline by a fixed step size, where these improvements or declines in their efficiency arrive with potentially different Poisson arrival rates. And lastly, they're going to just die exogenously at a rate that doesn't depend on the size of the establishment or on the location of the establishment. So with those assumptions, the value of the firm is going to take a form that looks like this. The value is going to depend on a couple of different components. So first is going to be an interest rate on the local capitalist portfolio. Firms are going to die at that constant rate. There are going to be some flow profits, which depend on your efficiency and also on your location. There's going to be an appreciation term, which reflects changes in the value of a firm at different points in space and time as people reallocate across the economy and move around across space. And there are going to be step changes in productivity. As I said, that's going to arrive with certain Poisson intensities, and that's going to give these growth terms in the value. Now, how do I make all this tractable with a potentially large number of locations and investment decisions moving around across time? Well, you can show that with the competitive construction sector, the building cost is going to depend on the flow of entrants through time. So when there's more entrants entering in a place at a given point in time, the cost of entry is going to be higher because there'll be some congestion in that construction sector. So free entry is then going to require you equating that entry cost with the expected value of starting up a firm in that location at that point in time. Now, spatial models, of course, we all know they can be tricky. You often have to keep track of distributions, but not in this case, because you can show that the value of a firm is actually linear in the efficiency term here, which means that only the value at the mean of entering productivity actually matters to characterize the entry and investment decisions of firms. So then you can show that entry becomes only a function of local state variables at time t. So basically entry is going to depend positively on profitability in that location, which is going to give a role for demand linkages and local demand to matter. And it's going to be forward looking. So entrance today is going to depend on the evolution of the entry cost through time. So I know that sounds like a lot, but there's basically 3 equilibrium equations that you can use to think about the behavior of the model. So 2 are static, 1's dynamic. So the static equation is the wage equation, essentially. So wages are going to depend on that local TFP term, which is potentially moving around. They're going to depend on the number of firms in the location and the average efficiency of the firms in that location. Labor supply is also going to be a static equation because workers are free to move across space at any point in time. So you're going to get relative employment across space being a function of relative wages, relative amenities at any point in time, and relative housing supplies. The only piece that's dynamic comes from that entry equation. So the entry is going to be a positive, it's going to depend positively on local market size. So how do these 3 pieces interact? Well, wages are going to increase with more firms. Those higher wages are going to attract more workers to the local area. And then that larger size is going to attract new entrants into that local area. So of course you can solve all the dynamics computationally just non-linearly, but to get a sense of how this evolution actually works, you can think about the linearized dynamics of a local productivity shock in different cases, depending on the mobility of workers across space. So if a place gets a productivity shock and no one is allowed to relocate across space, you've just got fixed populations in each place, you get some entry of new firms you get some new entry of firms over time in these places, but not much going on. If you then allow workers to move across space and to move to places that have higher wages, then their local demand starts to matter for the entry decisions of firms. New firms will enter, and that'll propagate those employment and wage responses through time. So if you compare a place with limited mobility, like a high land price elasticity, you'll get a greater response than a fixed population. Or a very low land price elasticity, you'll get much greater movement into that area, which will increase demand further and increase entry further through time. So to estimate this kind of equilibrium system, I need to think about a couple of different things. So first, I need 3 essentially key parameters. So first, I need a scale elasticity. So how wages rise with the number of firms in a location. So that would be the sigma parameter here. Problem is that the TFP in a location, I don't observe that, okay? So I need a strategy for dealing with that. Labor supply as well is going to depend positively on wages in a location. But of course, there's a simultaneity problem in there in that wages are also going to depend positively on the number of workers in that location through these market size effects. And the last thing is I need an entry elasticity with respect to local market size. And there you're going to be worried about autocorrelation of local shocks. So I'm going to pursue basically a moment condition strategy for estimating the parameters of these systems. And I'm going to isolate a spending shifter that comes from aggregate structural change. So what's the idea? Well, some places are hit quite hard by manufacturing's decline. So this is going to be akin to a sectoral productivity shock that causes low entry across sectors. I'm going to leverage a general equilibrium component of this manufacturing shock and use it to estimate the parameters of the system from its variation across space. So just as an introduction to that, if you look in the data at different commuting zones in the last 40 years, what we see is that the manufacturing heavy areas in 1975 saw their total employment grow much slower post about 1990. So here I'm showing you average employment growth relative to 1975 in 4 different groups of commuting zones. So the blue are places like Florida and the Mountain West that didn't do a lot of manufacturing in 1975. So they had less than 20% of their total employment in manufacturing. The red places are basically the Rust Belt, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that in 1975 had greater than 30% of their employment in manufacturing. And you can see a gap starts to open up very strongly between these areas after about 1990. And you see much slower growth in places that were doing a lot of manufacturing in 1975. So this is known. I think what's less known is that we see sluggish firm creation across all sectors in manufacturing heavy areas. So it's obviously the case that you see slower entry. So this is basically, I'm regressing the log change in the number of establishments over a 25-year period, 1990 to 2015, on the manufacturing share of employment in 1975, and a bunch of controls for geography, size, demography, and that sort of thing. Obviously, we see less entry in manufacturing, but you also see a dearth of entry across a range of different service sectors. So in particular, local services like restaurants, retail, and accommodation, and also ed and med, so you know, schools and medical establishments. And also you see reduced entry in construction sectors as well, in places that did a lot of manufacturing in 1975. So how am I going to use this variation to estimate the parameters of the model? Well, I'm just going to extend the model slightly to consider 2 sectors instead of 1. So I'm going to say firms can either be manufacturing or services firms, and we're going to have sectoral aggregation according to just a simple CES production function over services output and manufacturing output. And using this, you're going to get a labor allocation between sectors that's going to depend on a couple of different variables. So first, it'll depend on a local manufacturing productivity, which I'm going to say has a local component, little mj, and that reflects comparative advantage in manufacturing in an area. So whether the geography is favorable, cheap power, roads, these sorts of things. And also an aggregate term, which reflects aggregate structural change and the movement of the economy away from manufacturing. It's also going to depend on the number of firms locally in services and manufacturing, and these things are going to evolve endogenously within the model, and also local productivities will matter as well. So then you can show that wages are going to satisfy in log changes. The change in wages is going to depend on the change in the number of firms, say in the service sector, plus changes in the ratio of manufacturing to service workers, plus changes in local TFP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a guess for the parameters and solve for manufacturing comparative advantage that exactly matches dispersion in TFP across, dispersion in employment across space in 1975. And then I'm going to solve for the path of aggregate manufacturing demand to exactly match the path for manufacturing employment 1975 onwards. And doing this allows me to generate predictions for the number of firms entering in both services and manufacturing across space. And I'll use these predictions as instruments for the actual numbers of firms and entry that we saw across space. So basically what you're relying on is a moment condition of this form for each parameter, in that changes in local TFP need to be orthogonal to changes in the local number of establishments that are predicted just coming from the aggregate variation in manufacturing. So essentially it's like a Bartik, but a structural Bartik, where I'm relying on initial shares in manufacturing and aggregate declines in manufacturing employment, so exposure to aggregate declines in manufacturing employment. And so when you do this, you end up with different scale elasticities for manufacturing and service firms. So you get a higher scale elasticity for manufacturing. Wages are more responsive to local entry and manufacturing. And you can also back out the labor supply elasticities from house price elasticities and the entry elasticity as well. I also need to calibrate a bunch of parameters. So what I'm going to do on the firm life cycle, I'm going to calibrate those efficiency arrival improvements and deteriorations to match the first 4 moments of employment growth in the LBD. So essentially you're looking at the arrival rates of improvement, the step size of improvement, deterioration and step size. I'm going to calibrate that exogenous death rate of firms across space just to match the average exit rate in this period. And also I'm just going to set exogenously the curvature of the utility for the local capitalists just to be log preferences. Not a lot depends on whether you introduce some degree of risk aversion into those capitalist preferences. And I'm just going to fix the discount rate of the local capitalists. So what do you get when you do this? Maybe I'll stop there before I go to the results and actually take 1 or 2 questions because we've got a little bit of time.
So why don't we start with Adrian, who has had a question for a while.
Yeah. Thanks. Very interesting, Conor. I was wondering a little bit about the connection between the data and the theory.
Yeah.
My understanding is that your model relies heavily on, I mean, it's very elegant, and it relies heavily on the fact that the exit rate is constant and exogenous across areas.
It does.
The entry distribution is constant across cities. And my understanding is also that builds on these striking facts that you've shown, that the exit rates are completely independent of size, city size, and I was just wondering. So we also know that in the data, there's a lot of variation within size categories. I mean, exit rates do vary quite a bit within sizes.
Yeah.
The productivity of entrants is very different across cities within size bins, and connecting to the last week's presentation, the unemployment rates and job losing rates are in fact,
that's certainly true.
Most of the variation is within size.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, why the focus on city size in the empirical part, given that there's this rest of the variation that's also quite big and they're also in the data. I mean, obviously it buys you a lot of traction in the theory part.
Yeah. So no, it definitely
from an
does
empirical
help
perspective, what was the main motivation for focusing exclusively on city size?
So the only point I wanted to make there with city size is that as places expand and they grow, it doesn't look like we need to actually keep track of differences in firm dynamics in growth rates and exit rates across space. It's certainly true that there's a lot of heterogeneity across city sizes and within city size bins. I mean, I think one point that I'm making that's new is most of that heterogeneity emerges at entry. And once you control for age of the establishments, you actually don't see that much difference within or across cities, let's say. But you're right, like I'm leaning heavily on those empirical facts that exit rates don't look any different by size and growth doesn't look any different by size of city to inform the model. That's certainly true.
Thanks.
Maybe I'll take one more.
There was another question by Marina, which really came for the data part, which was about whether you're excluding existing firms that reallocate. I guess that's still relevant, given that in the model, firms can't reallocate once they've chosen a location.
Yeah, firms can't reallocate. So, I mean, this is a good question. In the US Census data, I mean, establishments do relocate, but very rarely. So almost the definition of establishment is a fixed address in space. They do move, but it's actually, it's when you actually look at it in the data, it's very rare. Now, that's not to say firms don't reallocate across space. Of course they do. They open some establishments here and close them there. But I'm just treating a firm as symmetric to an establishment. So even if you think about a firm as a collection of establishments, I'm modeling the incentives of incumbent firm owners the same way I'm modeling the incentives of totally new firms who are starting their first establishment. So again, it's a simplification for sure, but I think it actually buys me a lot in terms of the results I'm going to show. Okay. So just to understand quantitatively how this model behaves, so if you think about like a sector neutral TFP shock hitting an area that just increases productivity by 1% permanently in that area, and then trace out how the dynamics of the area evolve over time, what you can see is that a 1% increase in productivity, it leads to almost a 2% increase in wages, where that response of wages comes, the extra percent of wages comes slowly over the next sort of 10, 20 years as entry kicks off, new entrants come in and increase wages as they start up in that area. And also the employment response itself is almost as well doubled relative to the initial impact of that TFP shock. And you can isolate the component that's coming from just the TFP shock and how much is coming from the propagation. So if you don't allow anyone to move in response to that local TFP shock, you get a much more muted response of entry and wages to that initial 1% shock to productivity. And what that's showing is basically that the local demand of all the new workers that are coming in is a significant propagating force to the startup decisions and wage growth that we see within an area. What I also do is take the estimated model, the parameters of the estimated model, and then I'm going to estimate processes for those local TFP terms and those amenity terms moving around across space. And I'm going to do that in order to match exactly the variance in the distribution of growth rates employment growth rates at the 10-year horizon, and also their persistence through time. And when you do that, you can do a model decomposition and ask how much of the variation that we see in 10-year employment growth rates and how much of the persistence that we see is due to just coming from the underlying shocks to fundamentals and amenities, and how much is this green distribution here that is the shocks plus the propagation coming from entry. And basically the entry propagation doubles the dispersion that is coming from just the fundamental underlying shocks, let's say. Okay, so that's quantitatively the properties of the model. How about something a bit more real? So now I'm going to apply it to understand exactly what we've seen, the decline in the Midwest and these manufacturing heavy regions. So let me just go back for a second to this chart where I'm showing again employment growth relative to 1975 in these service heavy blue regions and these manufacturing heavy red regions. What does that look like through the lens of the model? Well, only varying the component that comes from aggregate manufacturing's decline, you get something that looks like this. So you get dispersion across commuting zones that depends only on their initial intensity in manufacturing. So obviously the blue regions here, again, are the service heavy regions of the US, the red are the manufacturing heavy regions. And if you shut down the propagation that comes from firm creation decisions in response to this aggregate manufacturing decline, you get basically a 52% reduction in the differential between the leading and the lagging areas of the US. So this is your Florida, Mountain West, kind of Oregon, and these are your Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan places. So what I'm saying is that you can explain basically half of the dispersion in employment between the fastest growing areas of the US rated for services manufacturing versus the slowest growing areas, just from propagation coming from firm creation decisions. Okay, so this wouldn't be kind of QSC without a little map. So here I'm just showing exactly these results, but across space. So you can think of a startup deficit emerging in response to that initial shock to manufacturing in the Rust Belt, and a second zone coming through here in Appalachia and kind of Tennessee. And what you can see is that there's basically anywhere from 20 to 40% of missing firms, I'll call them, in these regions in response to the decline of manufacturing and the movement of people away from these areas. And where have these people been moving? Like I said, they've been moving to Florida, they've been moving to Texas. And when they move, their local demand brings with it impulse propagation from new entrants of establishments and firms that are basically driving this dispersion between the fast growing and the slow growing areas of the US. So with that said, I'll talk a little bit about policy. So this is a work that's still under development. So, I mean, there's really two inefficiencies for a policymaker to consider here. So first is a very standard static inefficiency. So that there's static underinvestment in firms and the static underinvestment basically everywhere. So firm owners don't receive the full surplus of the act of creation, essentially, which leads to spatial misallocation across space. And what you can find is because there's a wedge between the true marginal social surplus of a firm and what the firm owner actually receives, you get misallocation of workers across space. In particular, you get too much crowding in inelastic regions. So the way to think about this is, if we were to basically increase entry everywhere, that raises wages everywhere, and workers take advantage of these higher wages by moving to the most elastic places of the US where housing supply can expand the most to take advantage of these higher wages everywhere. So I mean, that's a very standard static inefficiency. One I think is a little more interesting is that you also can show that, Adrian, you had a question, just jump in. I guess you're on the panel, so.
Thank you. Just in terms of the static underinvestment in efficiency. Yeah. So what is exactly the market that's failing in this case? I mean, if the land supply is competitively produced, and I mean, I think that's how it works, and the profits are rebated. What is exactly the margin that's
Yeah, no, there's really two things. So firms don't internalize their effect on local varieties, which is where the wage growth is coming from. And they also don't internalize their effect on raising local demand. When they move in, wages go up and workers move in to that area. So both of these things will cause an inefficiency in their startup.
So it's through the CES aggregator.
Exactly.
I see. Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks. So I mean, it's well known so where you wouldn't get an inefficiency is if the entry cost was just in terms of wages, then we'd have the efficient number of firms moving in. But as soon as you have some non-wage component of the entry cost, here I've got land, immediately that's going to introduce a wedge between profits essentially and startup costs that is not rebated to the firm. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. The second thing you see is that it's not just statically that there's underinvestment everywhere. There's also inefficiencies in dynamic adjustment to local shocks. So basically, reallocation of workers across space, even in the case of free mobility, is too slow. So the policymaker would like to speed the transition from declining to booming areas by incentivizing entry in those booming areas to get startups starting up faster and workers out of the declining areas quicker. So not only is there a long run inefficiency, there's also a second inefficiency on the transition path in the speed of transition between, say, two new steady states. So given this, place-based subsidies can either hinder or help the speed of transitions depending on their implementation. And I'm working on the quantitative results of this at the moment. Obviously, given this, what we see a lot of declining cities doing is trying to subsidize creation of new firms in these cities. From a societal welfare point of view, this is actually very costly. The planner would like to reallocate people from these declining regions to the booming regions, and it would like to do it much faster than the market is doing it. So there are a range of targeted subsidies that can help that reallocation. But yeah, so like I said, the quantitative results for this part are still forthcoming. So check back soon and I should have them for you. So, I mean, maybe I'll finish there and leave a bit more time for discussion. So what I've done today is sort of threefold. So at first I've shown you in the microdata, persistent entry is really key in accounting for local growth. So in the US microdata, at least in the medium run, the entry margin is dominant. Exit and life cycle dynamics look comparatively minor. And I've given you a way to think about this persistent entry as coming through demand spillovers. So there's a dynamic interaction of worker and firm location choice that can propagate fundamental shocks occurring to locations as workers and firms reallocate across space. And then quantitatively, this channel has given me a new way to talk about the spatial propagation of aggregate structural change. So we know that the devastation of manufacturing really hurts employment at the local level, but it also kills local firm creation across sectors. And this slow decay of the existing firm base may provide a policy rationale for a plan to speed up reallocation away from these declining regions by implementing a series of entry subsidies in the booming regions. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll take whatever questions are there.
Great, thank you very much, Conor, for a great talk. I think we're gonna start with Jonathan, who has just raised a question. Jonathan, I unmuted you.
Hey, Conor, nice job. I have a question about the manufacturing share instrumental variable. There's this interesting paper by Simeon Alder and David Lagakos and Leo Hanian that says that the decline of the Rust Belt is not just about the decline of manufacturing. And what they highlight is basically in a very steady way since World War II, the Rust Belt's share of national manufacturing employment, drops considerably, something like 20 percentage points over a couple of decades. And so, they have their particular story about unions and holdup problems and inefficiencies in the Rust Belt region being quite bad relative to other states and so forth. The broader question is your IV consistent with the idea that these manufacturing heavy places were declining even within manufacturing relative to other locations?
So essentially what one key identifying assumption that I'd need is that changes in manufacturing comparative advantage are uncorrelated with initial manufacturing shares in that area. So on the union story, I mean, if it's just that they're heavily unionized and that's not changing over time, then that's going to be consistent. But if it is changing in a way that is correlated with those initial manufacturing shares, then that'll be a problem for the estimation strategy. I mean, another one that I also use is that changes in productivity outside manufacturing also have to be uncorrelated with those initial manufacturing shares. So it's not that manufacturing regions are declining, of course they are, and they see endogenous productivity declines through the lens of the model. It's more, say, something like local road funding, depending on local tax revenues. If that's an important component of local productivity, and that changes when the tax base changes, then that's going to be a problem for the estimation for sure.
Okay, you might want to look at their paper in terms of, I don't know, but their hypothesized mechanisms might imply violations of the exclusion restriction. So like their story is that these high manufacturing places in the Rust Belt have unions, and then unions cause underinvestment. So if you don't have an explicit model of investment, I think productivity changes might be like underinvestment symptoms. So you might want to take a look at it.
Right. Yeah, I'd need to have a look at that. So yeah, I mean, obviously there is underinvestment coming endogenously through the model, but that's not differential based on whether there's a high union base or not. Yeah. If there's like a wedge between, say, the investment decisions of firms and unionization, let's say. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan and Conor. We have a Giacomo following up on this previous point now after the model. So Giacomo.
Yes, I'm afraid it is very much a follow-up. So even after the model, I am, maybe I didn't follow it well enough. I am still not sure what's different, particularly about new entrants. So if you take the policy prescription, you say, look, you want more firms because having greater firm density is better. Now, of course, you can do this by subsidizing entry. You could do this by subsidizing not exit to the extent that it's firms and not establishments. You could do this by forbidding mergers. Where is it in the model or in the evidence, and both that it has to be entry rather than lack of exit, lack of mergers, anything that produces lots of firms per capita?
That's a good question. I mean, there's nothing in the model that would imply that you need to subsidize entry per se. Entry is one way of doing it. You're right. There are other options, and I haven't considered fully the range of different things. But it's not. You're right. It's not. It's not necessarily just entrants that are special. It's just that the range, at least for the wage part of the model, it's the range of activity that's being done in a location that's raising wages, as you know.
Absolutely.
Speaks to.
But then at the cost of being a Glazer stooge, which of course everybody knows I am, I would say, look, then this is about firm density, which is great and which we still have not explained enough, right? I mean, it's a puzzle, and at some point, Gilles Duranton was promising that he would kill it and show that the effect is not there. He hasn't yet, but we're waiting. So I mean, like I'm saying, like there's I guess all I'm saying with the evidence at the start is there's nothing over the firm life cycle that makes you think that density is important per se over the life cycle. Whatever differences there are, they're emerging at entry, which is why I focus so heavily on it. Can I rule out all these other stories in the literature? No, certainly not. This is just one way of thinking about how firm creation decisions interact with worker location choices through demand, I guess.
Thank you, Giacomo. I think we have a question here from Clémence on the panel. So Clémence, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you, Fabian. I just wanted to know how you can think about land use regulations in this framework. So if I understand correctly, you're describing like a virtuous cycle where you have more people attracting more firms and more firms attracting more people, and all this contributing to growth. And so I'm wondering how you can explain land use restriction in this context, and also what could be the consequences on more long-term growth. So is it a way of stopping the divergence?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I'm taking land use regulations as given, as some, you know, fixed component of the geography, and certainly they're not. And you're right that the elasticity of land supply interacts crucially with this virtuous cycle. In particular, if it's hard for, say, employment to expand in an area, because house prices go up very rapidly when employment expands, say due to land use regulations, then that's going to stop a lot of these virtuous dynamics coming from entry. So yes, it's certainly true that if land use regulations are amenable to policy, there are other things you might want to do to improve welfare. But I guess, yeah, I'm sort of, for this part of the paper, I'm taking that as given, as something that the planner can't really affect.
So, yeah, so
yeah,
just because in some sense it would be welfare improving to see that land use regulations are taking place in like high growth areas, right? Because that's the case in the US. If you look, like the high regulations are typically like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City. So in your framework, yeah, good.
Well, so I guess there's a difference with employment growth and sort of outsized wage growth in the US. So the cities that are growing the most are actually the ones with the lowest land use regulations, right? Like places in Texas and Florida, let's say. And most of what I'm talking about is an employment-based story about how new entry expands employment within an area. If you want to look at, say, the outsized wage growth of San Francisco, Seattle, and New York, I think that's actually a very different story. And I have another paper with Fabian explaining exactly what's going on there, but I won't get into that now. But yeah, you're right. That's not what this story is about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clémence. We have Seth asking a question about amenities. Seth, I'm unmuting you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I was just interested in how amenities fit into the model and what data you're using to estimate them. I mean, sorry to raise the spectro glazer again, but you might think that sort of some amenities or externalities of high educated people moving in being positive might make a difference.
Yeah, no, certainly. So I mean, I'm being very brute force with amenities, I guess. So the amenities for me are just a residual in the model that rationalize worker and worker location decisions across space after wages have been taken into account. So they're a residual in my model. Yeah, and I'm taking movements in those amenities as given, as a fundamental that is moving people across space. So say like the invention of air conditioning moving people to the south of the US. Now, a bunch of work in urban has obviously said, no, these amenities are actually also endogenous to the location decisions of workers and firms. I mean, if you think that, say, amenities also react to population, that's going to be another source of propagation on top of the one that I've built into the model that'll amplify persistence of growth through time. But no, for this paper, I'm taking those movements as given.
Right, thanks.
Thank you, Seth. I think we have another question from a panelist. Marta has raised her hand.
Hi, Marta.
Hi, Conor. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So super interesting. I was wondering if, I mean, I may have missed this, but I was wondering about the role of risk. So many times we hear these stories about entrepreneurs not starting a business because it may be too risky. So I was wondering if your model could be used to think about, well, what if firms are actually underestimating or overestimating for example, the risk of dying, right? The exit rate. We see that this exit rate is quite constant, whether you enter in a high growth and a low growth place at entry. And do entrepreneurs know this or not? And could that be also some kind of policy
no, it's a fantastic question. And I guess the answer is I wish I could do that. So all the dynamics here, the fundamentals moving around, everything's moving around in perfect foresight. And even with that, I need some tractability coming from the structure of the model in order to be able to solve it. Doing, stochastic shocks to the actual fundamentals, introducing, say, aggregate risk into this economy becomes, I think, very difficult. And it's a problem, I think a lot of people are working on at the moment, but I definitely haven't been able to solve for this. So yeah, this is not a great way to think about risk influencing startup decisions in some places versus others. This is more about, say, fundamental spending going on. But yeah, it's something I'd love to know more about, and I am thinking about it, but it's pretty challenging, at least for me. It is.
Cool.
No, great question.
Thank you, Marta. We have another question coming in from Luis. Luis, feel free to talk.
Hi, I have a very quick question.
Yeah.
I noticed that the firm creation comes from more spending, right? By the workers.
That's right.
There's a different mechanism that is related to firm growth, which is that successful entrepreneurs tends to be the ones that have higher human capital.
Right.
When you're attracting people to these places that are growing a lot, you're attracting a lot of people with high human capital, which can be themselves very good entrepreneurs. So it becomes a cycle. So I'm wondering if there's a way to adjust the model that you have to reflect the migration of workers with high human capital, which can themselves be very good entrepreneurs.
No, it's a fantastic question. I mean, the main reason I haven't done that, even though I agree with you, I think that channel is very important, is that I just lack data to discipline the contribution coming from movement of entrepreneurs across space. In the census, we actually can't see who started a particular firm for most different establishments. There are some survey data that you can link to the census, but currently I just have no way to discipline the movement of entrepreneurs across space. But I think that's an exciting channel for future research if we can actually get data on that particular channel.
I wonder if it can be helpful for you to use the tax data, which might reflect where some of these entrepreneurs live to some extent, with some caveats, of course.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the IRS tax data I have is only on the firm side. I can't actually see anything about like the W-2s of the people who own the firm or who start the firm. I wish I could. I mean, I think if you can link those two things, that would be amazing for future papers. But currently, I can't do that.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. So I think that's it with questions, unless someone is quickly raising their hand.
Great.
Thank you everyone for attending today. And we have another one coming in from Matthias Hölzlein and from Clémence. Matthias took his hand down again, so why don't you, Clémence, ask your question?
Okay. So it's just a quick question about whether you can employ some exogenous movement of population as well. So you have an example with a manufacturing shock, so that would be on one side, but I guess the same should be expected on the worker side.
Yeah, right.
So, so I don't know if you could use like some random allocation of migrants.
Right. So, I mean, there is actually work on this right now. So looking at, say, migration shocks and productivity growth. I mean, and I think that's very consistent with my story. I mean, when you use like shift share instruments for migration from different countries at different points in time, you see elevated entry rates in those particular places. So, and it's not just high human capital migrants that are doing that. So it's not purely about a supply of entrepreneurial talent. There's definitely some role for demand going on. But yeah, other work has done that. So it's kind of why I didn't explore it here.
Thank you, Clémence. We actually have another question from Matthias Hölzlein. Yeah, Matthias, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. That was very cool, very interesting. Hi. So yeah, can you elaborate a little bit more on this static inefficiency, because and especially how that would interact with any kind of like entry subsidy, right? Because
yeah,
it's not so clear to me at this it's not so clear to me at this point how basically, because there's all demand, all consumption is local, correct? Produced locally and consumed locally,
or at least there's a component of local demand. So you can introduce, and I do introduce a trade structure, but there's something it can't be free trade across space in these varieties.
Right, because I mean there are these results that try to, that say like, okay, if everything's consumed locally, including the housing, right, the receipts from housing, then why doesn't that go into the coffers of the firm, right? So it's not so clear to me where the inefficiency is, where the lack of entry is, or not the lack of entry, the static inefficiency.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can take this offline and talk about it. But basically, yeah, like the standard CES model, when you just pay the entry costs in units of labor, there is no inefficiency. The efficient number of firms will be produced, basically because even though firms aren't getting a full, they're only getting a fraction of the surplus. That fraction is exactly how much wages are lowered by in the CES formulation. So these two things offset each other in the free entry condition. Whereas if the entry cost has some component that is reflecting, say, costly land, that wedge is not exactly the same. In fact, you'll find underinvestment in the number of firms. But maybe let's talk about this.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Conor, for your time and everyone attending. We hope to see you back next week for Martha's talk. And with that, let's call it a day.
Great.
Bye-bye, everyone.